Hi, I'm Jason Buffington with my friend and colleague Dave Russell from Veeam. For the last 2 years, Dave and I have been doing executive blogs where we go into a studio and we do recordings. This is episode 1 of live streaming where we can share some ideas on what's going on through the industry. Both of us, being former analysts, we look at the data first, we look at the landscape, and almost Veeam third in some cases. So, Dave, what's in the queue? What's episode 1?
Yeah, so episode one, I thought, Jason, let's kind of start at the very high point about Veeam espouses wanting to be the leader in cloud data management. And, so those 3 words, cloud data management, I thought we could unpack that a little bit. As we've talked about in the past, there is no one cloud. It's not a thing. There's many different types of clouds, public, private, different ways to exploit the cloud. We can double click on that. Then data management is a term or phrase that means many things to many different people. So if we think about what it might mean from a Veeam perspective, how we analyze the market, we've got a graphic that we can show about changing workloads. I think may best set this up. What do you think?
Sure.
So let's look a little bit about where things are coming and where they're going. And I'll actually throw it over to you, Jason, because I give you a lot of credit. We've just recently completed a global survey, and you were very instrumental in making this happen.
I appreciate that. So we just got done with Veeam has been running this survey for the last couple of years, and this was the first year that Dave, you and I got a chance to really be involved from the very beginning on how the project was going to go. It was all enterprises, so 1,000 users and up. 18 different countries had respondents, but we actually have coverage from about 40 countries as far as what kind of data protection they're influencing. And what you're looking at here is we asked organizations, what's their basic mix of server infrastructure of physical on the left-hand side, virtualized machines in the middle, and then cloud-hosted infrastructure on the right-hand side. The bright green is what they're doing today. And then the darker green is what they anticipate being over the next 2 years. And so one of the interesting shifts that we've been seeing for a while, but it's neat to quantify, is you'll notice there's about a 10% drop in physical infrastructure between now and over the next 2 years. That's what the left 2 bars show. Virtualization stays relatively flat, and then cloud hosting brings that up. Now, I would love to presume that people are just maybe leapfrogging over, but our customer conversations don't show that. What the customer conversations show is that we're going to see more conservative organizations continuing to move from physical down into virtual, whereas more progressive organizations are moving from virtual up into cloud hosted. So that shift is still happening. And I guess the only other thing I'd take away from that is physical's not going away anytime soon. Virtualization and the data center on-prem is not going away anytime soon. The new normal is hybrid, and the new normal is multi. And so that's the landscape we find ourselves in looking into 2022.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think especially unfortunately, given current global events that probably play out for a longer period of time than just the first part of this year,
Yep.
the notion of being very hybrid, having multiple different kinds of deployment models, different approaches to cloud. Now, we could make the reverse argument that some organizations may accelerate their movement into cloud, whether that's infrastructure as a service, particularly software as a service, but there's going to be a lot of hang on to what you've got as well. And I think it might be kind of interesting to riff on this from a Veeam perspective. We've got a slide that kind of shows now from various kinds of capabilities how Veeam attacks this, because when we say data management, particularly cloud data management, to your point, Jason, it's on-prem, it's virtual, it's physical, it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, private cloud, multiple public clouds. We could probably enumerate literally half a dozen other things. But what we see here, it looks busy, but I'll unpack it really quickly. The notion really is most important in the middle. We view this at Veeam as starting with backup and recovery, and Veeam is unapologetically a backup vendor. There's so many backup vendors that seem to want to now recast themselves as being something else, but it starts with backup and recovery for us for traditional data center workloads and increasingly more cloud-oriented. The bubbles that you see, though, the lighter shaded green bubbles, you'll notice that some of them are more or less overlapping with the middle bubble there where backup and recovery is in the middle of, and that's intentional.
Mhm.
What it means from Veeam perspective is, Jason, we don't think we're a security company. We're not going to deliver e-discovery as a good example, but we can do things by virtue of capturing data and providing data services that
Sure.
facilitate e-discovery. And there's some other things on here you could see as well, like endpoint backup, SaaS backups, means Salesforce, of 365, etc. And then the very large bubble there, cloud infrastructure as a service management, what we're doing with AWS, and literally in just a couple weeks with Azure, and a very aggressive release cadence for version 2 and version 3 of those products later this year as well. But when we add all this up in totality, it's around data protection, it's around advanced services, it's around policy-based management to deliver an outcome, and an outcome that is really aligned with the business.
Dave, thinking about that chart for just a second, the other way I think about that is not just from the adjacency of markets, but it's really about the have tos, the need tos, and the want tos that many folks have from an IT perspective, right? Front and center in that chart is backup and recovery, because that's kind of the have to. Regardless of where your data is, last month, this month, next month, you have to back it up. You have to have long-term retention. That's a have to. Right. And then from a responsible corporate custodian perspective, there are some need tos, like I ought to be doing more with security. I ought to be doing more with protecting my endpoints. But most folks can't do that because they're still too busy just trying to solve backup. Right. So
Yeah.
then you get to go from the need tos to the ought tos, and ideally to the want tos, the things that would actually unlock some value for the business. Just too busy keeping the lights on. And so I think of that as kind of that maturation curve.
Yeah, and what you'd like to do ideally is not have siloed tools to be able to accomplish this. So if you think about your point of have to, ideally in a perfect world, you are protecting or backing up or replicating your most critical data. Now so more than ever, perhaps. And
Sure.
if you've already done that, if you've already gone through all the trouble to ingest data into some sort of protection mechanism, what else can you do with that to unlock value? I mean, we used to say when we were analysts in our past lives that most people only actually restore roughly 2 to 3% of their data. But what's the trick? Well, trick is twofold. You didn't know which 2 to 3%, and you didn't know when. So if it really was critical, you should be protecting it on a very regular basis, at least once a day, and hopefully then you've got proper coverage. Now, along comes something like ransomware, and that kind of throws everything on its head, where the attack service could actually be 100%. And we'll give a quick commercial out towards the end of this, but we're going to do our next insights on ransomware, one of our colleagues, Rick Vanover. But curious on your thoughts on all of that, Jason.
Yeah, I think to me the problem is that not only do you not know what 2%, but the different kinds of crises that you are likely to face, whether it's ransomware where you specifically have to get an older previous version, or whether it's interruption of infrastructure where you really are counting on that most recent known good, right? So there's a range of recovery activities that you need. And by the way, backup alone does not satisfy that range. Right. So you need backup plus snapshots plus replication. You're doing it for physical and virtual and cloud, hosted and cloud SaaS. And so if you start doing it, point here, point there, point here, you've got all these point technologies doing this. And truly, you can't afford to do that. You certainly can't afford to do anything beyond that actually might be useful for the business. So consolidating those toolkits so that you can cover that range of recovery exercises, that should actually free up some of your operational staff and your CapEx and OpEx so that you can do those things that actually might be more material for the business later on.
Yeah, and I did a little foreshadowing on Rick Vanover's upcoming ransomware episode that he's going to do, but I'll harken back last week to David Hill and I did an episode around Veeam's portable data format and how that facilitates data mobility and cloud mobility. And I think that comes into play with what you're just describing. Not only do you not want a siloed tool, you don't want a stranded or captive data format that's sort of shrouded in mystery and it's very opaque. You want to be able to fluidly move data where you need it and when you need it at a certain location.
So I think we've got our first question coming in.
Yep.
Dave,
So
overcome objections from governors or from customers in the government sector, for example, when it comes to data security in the cloud?
Yeah, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing Imane's name, but thank you for the question first off. And so there are a lot of things to be concerned about. There's data sovereignty, and some liken that into the data security realm as well. So first and foremost, data transmitted into and out of the cloud should be in an encrypted format. There's also a need for different credentials, visibility, and scope,
Mhm.
making sure that you've got delineation of responsibilities, things like role-based access controls, but also who can actually touch what system and when. And then one of the things that Veeam likes to really point to is when we go into the cloud, when we send data through what we call a cloud tier operation, we can now write that in an immutable state. And all that really means is that we can make it encrypted and unable to be deleted until a certain time frame. So even if there was a rogue actor within your company, or if someone were to even hack your credentials, you wouldn't suffer data loss. If I really had to net that out, and I'll throw it over to you for your thoughts, Jason, is I think it's a multi-layered approach, but it starts with encryption. It goes through different access controls and delineation of responsibilities, and then ideally you've got something like immutability to help you further.
Yeah, so I've been at Veeam now for a little over 2 years, but I remember one of the last data protection projects I was an analyst for before I came over. We were looking at cloud adoption as part of a data protection strategy, and when respondents said that they were not using cloud as part of their data protection strategy, they often cited security concerns as their number one reason why they wouldn't use the cloud. And then when we asked organizations who said they were using cloud as part of their data protection strategy, and we said, what were the benefits that you got? Enhanced security was actually one of the things that they
Mm,
recognized as an improvement. And so I did some qual interviews with CTOs and CIOs around, okay, so tell me how this works. And what we often heard was that those folks that said they were not using cloud because of security concerns, they didn't understand how cloud worked. And those organizations that did use the cloud understood that foundationally, most cloud transmission for data in flight and data at rest, security and encryption is native to those protocols from the first day that hyperscale cloud started coming out. That's actually not true even on-prem, right? I mean, not everything is encrypted between your production server and your backup server if you're you're just on Ethernet alone. So you actually arguably have better encryption options, and in many cases, better role-based access concern issues when you're leveraging cloud-based infrastructure where there's a separation of credentials and data's in flight encrypted and at rest encrypted than you might have on that simple NAS drive that's on the wrong side of a gigabit switch from where your production server is. So actually, security in many cases can be better. The other thing that we often found is that when organizations would move from, say, one crappy backup solution to a more modern backup solution, they tended to leave the credentials alone. Oh, this is our backup agent account, and we'll leave
mm.
that in place. So when you're swapping things in place, most of the time the security doesn't get a refresh or an oversight or an inspection. When you change the core foundation architecture for how you're doing something, like we're not going to lay this on disk anymore, we're going to drop it up into a cloud, a lot of those security holes and those legacy credentials start to actually get sewn up as part of modernizing the infrastructure. So you'd be surprised how many ways your security can actually improve as you embrace cloud as part of your architecture.
Perfect. We've got a couple other questions that came in, and apologies if I mispronounced, but I think Yehuda has a question around what is Veeam's greatest strength? I'm going to struggle and come up with one. We like to say that we're simple, flexible, and reliable. Reliable certainly could be one of them, but I'll give you mine, and Jason, you chime in with yours. I'm going to say it's the portable data format, the ability to write in a self-descriptive manner and to move up to the cloud, from the cloud, across clouds, and to be able to do that in such a manner that it can be from laptop to Fortune 100 customer.
I'm gonna say, and it's not a short answer, but I'm gonna say it's how we accomplish easy to use yet flexible, powerful. And the reason I say it is because there's a lot of easy to use technologies out there, and the reason they're easy to use is because they don't have any features, right? If you only got three buttons, it's really easy. Pick the one on the left, right? But to actually have a lot of functionality and flexibility and yet still be intuitive and easy to set up and easy to manage is kind of a hat trick that we haven't seen in this industry. The products that were historically robust and powerful were also extremely cumbersome and complicated and needed pro services to deploy and a PhD to operate. And I love the balance of that. And we watched that as you know, as Veeam was coming up through the ranks. It wasn't the PhD in backup that was running it. It was the vAdmin who just needed to know the stuff was backing up. And as we've added new workloads, that ease of use experience continues to hold true. So I think that's our greatest strength.
Perfect. I have another question for Marwan, who asked about regarding SaaS, and is there a Salesforce protection on the horizon in the Veeam portfolio? And it's actually a very timely question, because just this week, Jason and I were doing some investigation on this, talking to an old contact that used to be in the data protection game, who's now actually associated with that application. I'll leave it at that. And what we're finding is, it's a very different administrator. So it's something we're actively looking at, is what I'll net it out to today. It's a different use case, different administrator, but we do recognize the need for it for sure. One other question that I want to touch on that Nadeem asked, maybe I'll throw this over to you, Jason, because you've been very involved in this, is, are there any future plans for a Veeam appliance, meaning from Veeam, an all-in-one product?
Yeah, we've had this question for a couple years along the way. The overly short answer would be no. It's not our goal to ship a bezel that has a Veeam logo on the front of it. But I think there's a longer answer that's more important, and that is that when you think about appliances, it used to be, when you talked about appliances, you were thinking about something that was a 2U or 4U chassis. It came out of the cardboard, and 30 minutes later, you were powering up and running data. And Dave, you and I each have about 30 years each in the data protection space. And I remember the last time that you and I were talking about this, you pointed out that never in the history of backup has the appliance been the predominant form factor.
No, it's never been higher than 15-20%.
Yeah, and if you think about it, when appliances first started coming into the fray, and you've got some history with one of the most robust and yet most venerable data protection products in market, but it was really, really, really complicated to set up. And one of the first ways to accelerate time to value was to ship an appliance that got rid of a lot of that day zero, day one experience along the way. That's not what today's appliances are trying to solve for. There's more than one way to solve day one and day zero. So if you want something that says, how easy is it to architect and stand up, making sure that you're right sizing hardware and software, we got lots of partners that are doing that. We've got a program called With Veeam that basically says, pick your favorite hardware. Right. And chances are your favorite hardware vendor has a With Veeam offering or With Veeam reference architecture, so that your hardware and software is right size, so that you can have a single SKU from your distribution or channel partner. And then you can accelerate that time to value along the way. What I don't want to do is, if you have all HPE hardware across your data center, right? And so everything you have for managing your firmware and managing all the hardware telemetry, if that's what you standardize on a platform, what I don't want to do is tell you, for you to have a fast day zero, you have to drop a super micro box in that rack, or you have to drop an Intel white box in that rack. I don't want to do that. If you like HP, then your Veeam appliance-like outcome should be on HPE gear. Right? If you're standardized on Cisco infrastructure, then your solution should run on Cisco gear. But I'm not going to tell you should drop atypical hardware into your environment just so you can have a better day one experience. I'd rather make sure that you have a great day one experience regardless of whose hardware you use.
Yeah, and I want to get to another question, but I'll just double click on that just slightly further. Just say, VMware software first and foremost. To your point, Jason, about relabeling a super micro box, that's really not what we think we can really bring a lot of value to the table. We're 100% channel oriented, got a huge ecosystem of partners. So we've got a Nutanix Mine offering in the field now that's very much like what some of the other all integrated appliance vendors are offering. We've got great integrations with, to your point, Jason, HPE and Cisco, and certainly some activities with Exagrid where we've combined our data mover into that solution. And obviously we work with other things as well, whether it's data domain or just a bunch of disk or flash or certainly NetApp, and the list goes on pure storage.
Right.
So I think we hit that one pretty well. Want to hit this one because it's one near and dear to my heart, which is around NAS. The question specifically from Juan is there a plan for NDMP native support for granular restore? And I will say there's not one, but, and here's the important but. So NDMP is essentially an end of, well, it is not essentially, it is an end of development. It's essentially an end of life protocol. It hasn't been advanced now in some number of years. So earlier this year in version 10 of Veeam, we came out with what we call enhanced NAS, where we do our own changed file tracking mechanism that's not dependent on any specific NAS, meaning it could work with Isilon, it can work with NetApp, it could work with Synology, or just even file shares on Linux and Windows. That is where we can offer granular restoration. And by granular, I mean, to your point about a file, and then the other end of the spectrum, the entire data center. So if your entire NAS system gets hit by ransomware, we can take literally billions of files to a known point of integrity with just a slider of your best data point that would match what you want to get back to.
Yeah, I think 20 years ago when I first started learning about NDMP, I actually thought it was an abbreviation for NAS dump. And that's all it was supposed to be, was just take all the data, dump it to a tape, and we'll figure it out later. I mean, it's amazing how long that has been the only method up until recently to actually do NAS-based protection for quite a while. So glad we finally have a better NAS answer.
Perfect. I know there's a couple other questions. We'll try to get to them offline, but Jason, why don't you kind of tell us what's coming up next in the series?
So next in the series is our colleague Rick Vanover. Rick is up and he's going to talk about winning the war on ransomware. If you've not heard Rick speak before, you are in for an absolute treat. He has a fantastic ability to take really complex technology problems and make them actionable as far as how you actually work through the problem and come with the solutions. So what he's going to talk about is kind of beyond backup, the strategies to actually win. So attack, I don't even know. He has forgotten more about cybersecurity than I ever learned. So it's about attack vectors. It's about how to prepare for the attack. It's about how to handle the situation when it actually happens. It's already on my calendar. It ought to be on yours too.
Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in for episode 1. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, stay positive, and thank you.